Okay, good morning everybody. So in this section of Commerce 2020, me and some of my team are going to be talking about trends. So to start with, I'm going to talk about 5 e-commerce trends I think you need to be aware of when defining your future-proof e-commerce strategy. Then Chloe Cox, one of our consultants, will be talking about mindset-driven purchasing, focusing primarily on the female shopper. And finally, Naji El-Arifi, our global innovation lead, will be talking about the future of the interface. So for those of you here last year, you'll have heard me talk about some other trends. So I talked about zero UI and how screens would cease to become the primary interface with the internet and the services that it offers. I talked about programmatic commerce and how machines would start ordering on behalf of consenting consumers. I talked about proactive peak formation, how the retail innovators were starting to define new peaks in the market. Black Friday, Singles Day, Amazon Prime Day, for the benefit of themselves, but also for the benefit of their customers. And finally, I talked about interface imperialism, how some of the digital innovators were trying to own the customer by owning their touch points and owning the interfaces. And over the course of the next presentations, you'll hear about how some of those trends have developed, because in e-commerce, 12 months is a long time. And over the last 12 months, we've seen an enormous amount of expansion. Expansion into new geographies, expansion into new hardware, expansion into new industries. And yet still, many organizations are struggling with their e-commerce strategies. Why is that? Well, is that because they're too busy concentrating on hitting today's numbers and they're not thinking about the future? Is it because they're paralyzed by fear of the unknown, fear of e-commerce? Could it be their culture or their organization that's holding them back? Or is it everyone's favorite scapegoat, the out-of-touch exec teams who really don't know what their customers want? Whatever the reasons, it's 2018, and e-commerce now accounts for anything between 9 and 20% of all retail sales, depending on who you believe. In the trends document that we published last year, we identified that the e-commerce illiterate CEO was dead. But more to the point, time is now running out for the e-commerce illiterate company. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is 5 e-commerce trends that I think you need to know about when defining your e-commerce strategy. I'm going to talk about the growing influence of the interface imperialists. I'm going to talk about the role and ownership of infrastructure. I'm going to talk about the importance of delivery. I'm going to talk about loyalty to service, not brand. And finally, I'm going to touch very briefly on omnichannel. But before I talk about trends, I want to talk very briefly about balance, or more specifically, balanced e-commerce strategies. Now, across all the work we do globally, we tend to find that lots of e-commerce strategies are quite narrow and quite simple. And that's because they tend to be quite reactive. So they're driven by what competitors are doing, they're driven by executive teams, they're driven by unrealistic timescales. And quite often, the customer plays little or no role. Now, while it's true to say that any e-commerce strategy is better than none, what we tend to find is that reactive e-commerce strategies tend to be initiated in the wrong way. And if you initiate your e-commerce strategy in the wrong way, you tend to get the wrong e-commerce strategy. Now, we're not saying that e-commerce is simple. Far from it. In fact, we more than anyone know how complex e-commerce operations are. But e-commerce strategies don't need to be overcomplicated either. So we think you really need to be concentrating on 3 key areas: selling and optimizing through marketplaces, selling and optimizing through retailers, and selling direct to consumer, D2C. Now, each one of these can be dialed up or dialed down according to you, your brand, your business, your industry. But at least knowing the merits of each, or the relative merits of each, can ensure your e-commerce strategy at least starts from a balanced perspective. But enough about balance, let's talk about trends. And let's talk about my first trend, the growing influence of the interface imperialists. Now, whether you're in e-commerce or thinking about getting into e-commerce, you need to know what your competitors are doing. The problem is that in e-commerce, your competitors include some of these guys. So Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple, and Alibaba. And some of these guys have their eyes set on your customers, on your industry, and on your margins. Now, at Salmon, we call this group of organizations the interface imperialists. Now, why do we call them that? Because they seek to own every single interface with the customer to become the default choice for whatever that customer wants to do. And why do you want to do that? Well, because if you own the interface, you own the customer. If you own the customer, you own the data. And if you own the data, you own the future. Now, probably the biggest and best known interface imperialist out there is, of course, Amazon. As we all know, it's incredibly hard to get any data out of Amazon. So earlier on this year, we ran some research to try to identify just how much influence Amazon has in the market. And our research indicates in the UK, Amazon accounts for 39% of all of our online spend, while in the US, that's 57%. And this is, of course, before Amazon has matured its grocery offering. And over the course of the last year, fueled predominantly but not exclusively by Amazon, we've seen a huge amount of growth. So we've seen expansion into new markets with new brands. We've seen expansion into new interfaces and new devices. And we've seen expansion of the services available through those interfaces and devices. And again, just to reiterate that point, why have we seen such a huge amount of growth? Well, because if you own the interface, you own the customer. If you own the customer, you own the data. And if you own the data, you own the future. Now, what's really interesting about this group of organizations is not only do they try to own the interface, but they also try to improve the interface and improve every single touch point. And they do that with a meticulous approach to friction points. So if we look at what Amazon's done over the last couple of years, we can see how it's really approached friction points. So when they identified that payment was too slow, they introduced one-click ordering. When they thought delivery was too slow, they introduced Amazon Prime. When they thought 24 hours was too long to wait, they introduced Amazon Prime Now. When they thought store stock was all wrong, they started to use data to inform it with the Amazon Bookstore. When they thought screens were slowing people down, they introduced Voice, Alexa, and Echo. When they realized that people like voice, but they also miss seeing stuff, they reintroduced the screen, Show and Spot. And when they thought people hated queuing, they trialed Amazon Go. So I guess, well, what does this matter to you, and why am I telling you this, and why do you need to be wary of the growing interface imperialists? Well, your customer experiences and your touch points are being owned. Your customer experience is being revolutionized, and your customers' expectations are being transformed. So what the hell can you do about that? Well, Batman says, to conquer fear, you must become fear. Or to put it another way, to conquer Amazon, you must become Amazon. Okay, well, that's probably going to be a little bit difficult for most of us in this room, but at very least, we should be learning from Amazon. So that's anything from creating your own ecosystem, to expanding horizontally with a bit of aggression, to using your stores as a distribution centers of the future, to doing something as simple as just sorting out your data. And in fact, Eric Heller later on will be talking about how you can harness Amazon to your advantage. And what about this concept that we see more of, WACD, what Amazon cannot do, focusing on curation, specialism, and expert help. Now, one organization that's really understood the benefits of a balanced e-commerce strategy is Nike. So it's all too aware of the benefits of the marketplace in terms of reach and scale, but also the risks for its customer experience. And if we look at their footwear business, we can really see how they've applied that balanced strategy. So through the marketplaces, they sell their generic footwear. Through the retailers, they sell their exclusives, and then they drive customers to D2C through personalization and Nike ID. A great example of a balanced e-commerce strategy. So what's our advice? Well, first and foremost, you need to be aware of the growing influence of the interface imperialists. You need to define and diversify your e-commerce strategy. And you need to try to own the interfaces with your customers before someone else does. And you need to do that to strategically safeguard your future. And while we're talking about strategically safeguarding your future, let's talk about my second trend, the role and ownership of infrastructure. So what do I mean by infrastructure? Well, I mean anything that enables or facilitates a customer's e-commerce experience. So that could be an online shop, that could be a warehouse, that could be the hardware, that could be the logistics. Now, what's interesting is that as commerce has become more digital, the role of infrastructure has become more and more important. And the reason it's become more and more important is because customers are increasingly craving ease, speed, and convenience. And you can't offer ease, speed, and convenience without great infrastructure. So while we might view Amazon as the organization from which we buy 39% of all of our online goods, on the other hand side, we can view Amazon as a facilitation company. So a company that facilitates us as customers, so what we want and what we desire, but also that facilitates other organizations to sell online. And it does that through its physical and its digital infrastructure. So what are some examples of that infrastructure? Well, the infrastructure of the online marketplace, the infrastructure to access customers, the infrastructure to sell and pay, the infrastructure to warehouse and stock, the infrastructure to fulfill, even the infrastructure to host. And this is a genius piece of strategy because so many organizations can only achieve their e-commerce ambitions as a consequence of the infrastructure that Amazon offers. And obviously, if you own the infrastructure which your competitors require to survive, then your competitors are beholden to you. And in fact, we see this trend globally. So while in the West, Amazon has invested in logistics and delivery and infrastructure, in the East, we see investment in infrastructure around payment. So Alibaba has invested in payment options in a region where payment is required to be fast, where bank account penetration can be low, and where government regulation around payment can be quite high. Now, Jeff Bezos, he really understands the benefit of infrastructure. So recently when he was talking about setting up Amazon, he said that the reason he was able to innovate was a consequence of the infrastructure that existed. So when he was setting up Amazon, he didn't need to create the infrastructure of the internet, he just built his site on top of it. And he didn't need to create the infrastructure to send books to customers, he could just use the infrastructure of the US Postal Service. So he truly understands the benefit of infrastructure. Which leads me on to space. So how might you ask? Well, Jeff Bezos was recently talking about space, and he said the reason why there's so little innovation in space is because there's so little infrastructure. So if you invest in the infrastructure of space, then you allow for innovation to take place. Or to put it another way, if you invest in the infrastructure of space, you can control the space interface. So sorry to take something that is really cool and really exciting and make it really, really boring, but space. It's not the next frontier, it's just another interface to control. But that's the question is, why would you want to control the interface of space? So perhaps you wanted to mine it for its natural resources. Perhaps you're from the Elon Musk school of thinking and you want to create the conditions for the human race version 2.0. Or perhaps it's something a lot more mundane. Perhaps it's about the future of commerce. Perhaps it's about building, warehousing, and distributing from space. All sound a little bit far-fetched? Well, let's take a look at some of Amazon's pending patents. And suddenly the future doesn't seem quite so far off. So that's anything from its anticipatory package shipping, to its aquatic storage facilities, to its airborne fulfillment centers. And suddenly the concept of commerce in space doesn't quite seem so far-fetched. But why am I telling you this? Well, this is what we're up against. So while many of us in this room are considering whether we should sell through marketplaces, or be optimizing through retailers, or sell direct to consumers, Jeff Bezos is thinking about the future of commerce and the infrastructure of space. This is what we're up against. So that's great, Hugh, but what the hell can I do about that? Well, you need to think strategically about what infrastructure you own or could own. You need to assess how much of your operations are contingent on other organizations, particularly Amazon. And if possible, you need to start to invest in your own self-reliant infrastructure. And one thing that great infrastructure gives you is great delivery. And that moves me on to my third trend, the importance of delivery. Now, the final mile has long been a challenging, expensive part of the e-commerce experience, but it's also been part of the experience that's forgotten about the customer. So here's a bit of a news flash. The customer experience does not stop at checkout. No, it carries on right through from checkout to delivery to ownership to repurchase. And in fact, our research indicates that 25% of all e-commerce issues stem from delivery. Now, we've probably all got some examples of this, but I have one from Christmas this year. So I ordered my wife a necklace on Etsy, ordered it in November, it was made in the US and sent out. It arrived. Well, I say it arrived, but it turned up at my Royal Mail depot centre. My wife, not knowing what it was, went to collect it. When she got there, the tax hadn't been paid. In addition, she also had to open up the package to confirm the contents. So not only was her Christmas present surprise ruined, but she had to pay for the privilege of having it ruined. Not a great experience for her, certainly not a great experience for me, and not a great experience provided by the vendor, who I would never use again. Because the fact is that customers view delivery as part of the customer experience, even if many organizations and individuals operating online do not. What we also find is that expectations around delivery are changing. So in 2016, we ran some research which indicated that on average, customers were happy to wait 2.6 days for the goods that they'd ordered online to arrive. We reran the research a year later, and it told us that 60% of consumers felt that all retailers operating online should be able to deliver within 1 day. This is the Amazon Prime effect. Not only does it show changing customer expectations, but it also shows the speed at which they're changing. So what does all this mean for you? Well, you need to review your delivery logistics. Do they enable you to keep your offering in line with your customers' expectations? If you work with partners, are they effectively engaging with your customers? And you need to critically assess how your customers will react to your delivery. For instance, does it encourage repeat purchase? Well, we're talking about repeat purchase. Let's talk about my fourth trend, loyalty to service, not brand. Our research indicates that we've now reached a tipping point where customers are more loyal to service than they are to brand. What does that mean? That means given the choice between their favorite brand and a brand that they like, which offers them better service through ease, speed, and convenience, the consumer will choose the latter. What we mean then is that service is diluting the power of the brand. In fact, that's going to be a pretty big challenge for some organizations like these, who spent decades investing in their brand equity, but who don't own the service element of their delivery. And that's going to force a pretty big reassessment of budgets, of organization, and of logistics. Now, of course, Jeff Bezos really gets his point, and he says customers are only loyal to Amazon up until the point that someone offers them a better level of service. Because in the future, the organizations that win are those that are going to bring together great brands, great products with great service. So the question that then poses is, are we moving to a brandless future? And the answer to that's no. There will always be brands that resonate with us as customers, but how we search for them, how we find them, and how we receive them will define our loyalty to them. And that's why we see this growth in the concept of CXD and service blueprinting, so customer experience design, which focuses on key touch points in a customer's journey and identifying how to improve the service that customers get. So what's our advice? Well, you need to critically assess the service that you offer. What works, what doesn't, who's doing it better. You need to use customer experience design and service blueprinting to redesign your customers' interactions and improve the service that they get. And you need to constantly innovate with the service that you offer to ensure that you stay in line with your customers' expectations. So finally, I'd like to talk very briefly about omnichannel. Now, I know what you're all thinking. Boring. So the concept of omnichannel has been so overused as to render its impact almost zero. But embarrassingly, I'm actually very excited because we now stand on the cusp of true omnichannel retailing. And the reason why is that a number of retail innovators have understood that omnichannel isn't about selling through different channels, but it's about the seamless transition across those channels. And in order for that to happen, you need to sort out your data. Now, we often get asked to give some examples of great omnichannel retailing, and it's actually quite hard to do. There aren't that many. But unsurprisingly, Amazon is further ahead than most. And a great example is, of course, the Amazon bookstore. So this is a store heavily influenced by what's sold online, with customer ratings and reviews brought from online into store, and where the price that you get depends on your Prime membership or not. And we also see omnichannel start to come into effect with Amazon's big purchase of 2017, Whole Foods. So we start to see Echo being sold alongside groceries. Just the other week, Amazon announced it was going to use Whole Foods as the basis for its Amazon Prime Now food delivery service, a 1 to 2 hour delivery service in select US cities. And in addition, if you're a Prime member, you get your 5% discount if you shop at Whole Foods. Now, the challenge with effective omnichannel operations is that they require business change. That's especially relevant if you're not a pure play digital. And what many of us in this room know is that getting commitment to business change, well, that can be relatively easy. Getting budgetary commitment to business change, well, that can also be relatively easy. But actually getting businesses to take the big business-changing decisions they need to do to change, that can be really hard. But change they must, because to succeed in e-commerce, you're going to need to have the heart of a retailer and the brain of a digital innovator and data company. And so we'll start to see less of the concept of omnichannel and more of the concept of cross-channel data-driven retailing. Like I said, I'm really genuinely excited because we are experiencing the dawn of true omnichannel retail at last. So, in conclusion, I talked about the requirement for a balanced e-commerce strategy. I've talked about how you need to be wary of the growing influence of the interface imperialists. I've talked about the role and ownership of infrastructure and space. I've talked about the importance of delivery and the customer experience. I've talked about how customers are increasingly loyal to service, not brand. And I've touched very briefly on omnichannel. But in a world where the digital and retail innovators are finally giving customers what they want, when they want, and how they want, it's time we all upped our e-commerce game.